The Sculptor's Dream. On a stormy winter night, as lightning struck the horizon with an intensity that seemed to split the very sky, a small boy sat in his bedroom, his fingers covered in clay, shaping it into something only he could understand. He was only 5, but his mind was far beyond his age. There was something mystical about the way his hands moved, as if the clay itself whispered to him. The boy's name was Elias, and in the dim light of his room, as the wind howled outside, he felt like the master of the universe. His parents, Sarah and Jonathan, were in the kitchen, oblivious to what was happening upstairs. They were making tea, talking about their day and the upcoming holidays. Life seemed simple, comfortable, even predictable. It wasn't that they didn't notice Elias's odd behavior, but they brushed it aside. "He's just playing with clay," they'd say. Every child does something like this at that age. But what Elias created was different. His creations didn't look like the usual lopsided animals or misshapen figures most children made. No, his shapes were more defined, more intricate. Every time his mother entered the room, she would stop for a moment, marvel at what he had made, and then walk away, thinking it was just a phase. Elias didn't care what anyone thought. The clay was his world, and he was its creator. It wasn't long before his talent began to grow. At the age of 9, he sculpted his first human figure, a perfect replication of his own father, Jonathan, in a seated position, eyes closed, as if in deep thought. Sarah was astounded. "Where did you learn this?" she asked, though she knew the answer was impossible. Elias had never been taught how to mold such fine details. No one had ever shown him how to create such lifelike art. As Elias grew, so did his skill. By the time he was 15, he could mold anything, people, animals, buildings, each one more lifelike than the last. His sculptures started to be displayed at local exhibitions. People came from all over, drawn by the rumors of the teenage prodigy whose creations seemed to come alive under the touch of his hands. His parents, still in disbelief, watched as their son's talent flourished, though they couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond mere artistry was at work. One evening, when Elias was 17, he worked late into the night on a piece that would change everything. The full moon shone brightly through his window, casting long shadows across his room. Elias was in a trance-like state, molding and shaping clay as if he were not even aware of his surroundings. The figure he was creating was different from all the others. This one felt different to him, more real, more alive. He had been sculpting the figure of a woman, a beautiful woman, with flowing hair and an ethereal presence. Her face was serene, as though she had stepped out of a dream. He had spent hours working on her, his hands guided by something far beyond his control. When he finished, he stood back and looked at his work, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was breathtaking. There was a glow about it, something that made it feel almost too real. That night, as Elias fell asleep beside his creation, something strange happened. The room grew cold. The wind outside picked up, howling like a wild animal. A sharp gust of wind blasted through the room, and in that instant, the woman in the sculpture opened her eyes. Elias gasped, waking up in a panic. He rushed to the figure, his heart racing. The woman in the sculpture was alive. Her eyes were full of emotion, and her lips curled into a soft, knowing smile. "Who are you?" Elias whispered, his voice trembling. "I am the creation of your soul," she replied, her voice smooth, almost musical. "You called me into being. Now, I have come to you." Elias couldn't comprehend what was happening. He stumbled backward, his mind struggling to grasp the reality of the situation. He had made her, but this was impossible. And yet, there she was, standing before him, her form made of clay, but undeniably alive. Her hands reached out toward him. "You are not alone, Elias," she said. "I have come to guide you." The woman, who introduced herself as Lyra, explained that she was not just a sculpture, but a manifestation of his deepest desires, his innermost thoughts. Elias's hands had given her life, but it was his heart and mind that had brought her into existence. She was his creation, but she was also a part of him. Over the next few days, Elias was consumed by Lyra's presence. She was everything he had ever dreamed of: beautiful, intelligent, and kind. They spent hours talking, discussing art, philosophy, and the mysteries of the universe. For the first time in his life, Elias felt truly understood. He could not remember a time when he had been so captivated by someone. But as their connection grew, something else began to change. Elias noticed that Lyra was no longer just a figure of his imagination. She was becoming more real, more tangible. The lines between fantasy and reality were blurring, and Elias could feel himself slipping further into her world. One night, as Elias worked on another sculpture, a figure of a man this time, Lyra came to him with a look of concern. "You must be careful, Elias," she warned. "What you are creating is powerful. The more you give life to your creations, the more you risk losing yourself in them." Elias didn't understand at first. "But I can't stop. I'm creating things I never thought were possible," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "I can bring anything to life." "That is true," Lyra said, her tone soft but firm. "But there is a price. The more you create, the more of your soul you give away. Eventually, you will lose yourself in the world you've built. You will no longer be able to tell the difference between your dreams and reality." Elias was conflicted. He loved Lyra, but her words left a lingering doubt in his mind. He didn't want to lose her or himself. But he couldn't stop creating. The clay, the art, it was everything
to him.
And with every new piece, every new life he breathed into his sculptures, he felt more and more powerful. But soon he realized that power came at a cost. His creations began to take on a life of their own, growing beyond his control. The first sign came when the man he had sculpted, his latest creation, began to move. At first, it was small, subtle movements, a twitch of a finger, a shift of the eyes. But it quickly escalated. The man stood up from his pedestal and walked across the room, as if he were alive. Elias watched in horror, realizing that his creations were no longer just art. They were something more. They were beings with their own desires, their own will. Lyra warned him again, but this time her voice was tinged with fear. "You must stop, Elias, before it's too late." But Elias was too far gone. He continued to create, each new piece more elaborate, more powerful than the last. Soon, his house was filled with living sculptures. Some were beautiful, like Lyra, while others were dark and twisted, the result of his subconscious desires and fears. They began to demand more and more of his attention, pulling him deeper into their world. One night, Elias stood in the center of his room, surrounded by his creations. Lyra stood beside him, her once serene face now filled with sadness. "You've lost yourself, Elias," she said quietly. "These beings, they are no longer yours to control." Elias looked at the faces around him, his sculptures, his creations, each one staring at him with eyes full of longing and despair. And then, in a moment of clarity, he realized the truth. He had lost himself. He had become so consumed with his creations that he had forgotten who he was. With a heavy heart, Elias took his final steps toward his destiny. He knew what he had to do. He had to let go. Slowly, with trembling hands, he began to destroy his sculptures one by one. The clay crumbled beneath his fingers, the figures collapsing into dust. It was painful, but necessary. He had to free himself from the world he had built. As the last sculpture fell apart, Elias felt a weight lift from his chest. Lyra stood beside him, her form fading, her smile a bittersweet memory. "You've learned, Elias," she whispered. You've learned that creation is not just about bringing things to life. It's about knowing when to let go. Elias looked around the room, now empty of the creatures he had brought into existence. He felt a sense of peace, a calm he had never known before. The storm outside had finally subsided, and the moon shone brightly through his window once more. And as he stood there, alone but not lonely, Elias realized that true creation came not from power, but from understanding himself, his desires, and his limitations. He had learned the most important lesson of all, that in the end, it wasn't the sculptures that mattered. It was the soul of the artist that made everything come alive.
Quarto mini.
Whispering echoes.